This is Bukhari.
Hello.
And he made this. It's supposed to be the most authentic compilation of the Prophet's sayings and actions, also known as Hadith.
This statement is authentic.
This is his student Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj.
Hello.
And he made this. It's supposed to be the second most authentic compilation of Hadith.
Yes, this statement is authentic.
Now here are all these other guys, and they compiled all of this. Some are authentic, some are weak, but scholars go through them to attempt to discern which ones are really from the Prophet through this intense science they created. Then there's also this guy. His name is Ibn Majah.
Hello.
He made this, Sunan Ibn Majah. He tried to compile all authentic hadith, but later scholars noted that a fourth of the entire compilation was actually weak. All of these compilations have something in common. They're baseless. I'll show you. The science that determines the authenticity of a hadith is called al-Rijāl. Rijal experts go through each individual in the chain in order to determine their trustworthiness. The issue is that Rijal experts often contradict each other. One scholar calls a narrator trustworthy, while another calls him weak in their hadith transmission. Take this guy for example, Ikrima, the slave of Ibn Abbas. Uthman ibn Hakim said, "I was sitting with Abu Umama ibn Sal when Ikrima arrived. Ikrima said, 'O Abu Umama, I ask you by God, did you hear Ibn Abbas say, whatever Ikrima narrates for me, believe him, for he has never lied about me?' Abu Umama replied, 'Yes.' Ibn Lahiya added, Ikrima also adopted the beliefs of Najd al-Haruri, a leader of the Khawarij, and spent 6 months with him. Then he returned to Ibn Abbas, who upon seeing him said, 'Here comes the evil one.' Yahya ibn Bukair said, Ikrima traveled to Egypt and lived there. Then he went to the Maghrib, where the Khawarij of that region took their beliefs from him. Ali ibn al-Madini said, Ikrima followed the views of Najd al-Haruri, the leader of the Khawarij. Ahmad ibn Zuhair said, I heard Yahya ibn Ma'in say, Malik did not include Ikrima in his Muwatta because he followed the views of Sufriya sect. Amr ibn Qais al-Makki narrated from Atta, Ikrima was an Ibadi, another Khawarij sect. Abu Maryam said, Ikrima was a Bayhasid, another faction of the Khawarij. Yahya al-Katan said, Ibn Abbas' top 6 students were Mujahid, Tawus, Atta, Sa'id, Ikrima, and Jabir. Ikrima received contradictory evaluations from hadith critics. Some praised him, while others severely criticized him. Despite accusations of lying, belonging to a violent sect responsible for killing Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, and reportedly standing outside mosques, takfiring the inhabitants, his narrations were still deemed reliable enough to be included in Sahih Bukhari. This inconsistency highlights the subjective nature of Rijal methodology in their hadith authentication. Personal biases also impacted the comments made about certain narrators. Narrators were slandered if their views opposed those of hadith scholars. Take for example Imam Malik. He slandered Ibn Ishaq and called him a Dajjal. Ibn Ishaq compiled the biography of the Prophet Muhammad that Muslims accept today. Yet, Imam Malik called him out for his deceptions and was slandered across the Rijal corpus.
You lack conviction.
Al-Rijāl is also just circular reasoning. We trust a narrator because a biographer said so, but we trust the biographer because someone else said so. Take this hadith for example. The Prophet narrates to Ibn Abbas, who narrates to Ikrima, but how do we know Ikrima is trustworthy? Look at his biography. Yahya said he was trustworthy, but how do I know Yahya al-Katan is trustworthy enough to make that judgment? How can I trust Yahya? Let's look at his biography. Ibn Hatim al-Razi said he was trustworthy, but how do I know Ibn Hatim al-Razi is trustworthy enough to make that judgment? Until an endless circular loop occurs where I can never know who is objectively trustworthy, which makes all of these comments hearsay. Individuals who forged or altered chains still appeared in authentic hadith compilations. Take for example Sulaiman al-Aʿmash. He's reported to have committed tadlis al-isnad, essentially lying about his source of a narration, yet he narrates countless hadith in the most authentic compilation of hadith, and even more in the lesser authentic books. Scholars have tried to wiggle their way out of this by saying, well, he only committed tadlis for certain narrators, so we can accept his narrations when he doesn't narrate from those specific people. But this is a stupid argument. It's like saying, well, this journalist only fabricated sources for political stories, so we can trust their reporting on everything else. Or like saying, this witness has only perjured himself when testifying against certain defendants, so his testimony is reliable in every other case. But when someone demonstrates a willingness to falsify their sources, their entire credibility is compromised, not just in a specific instance. This selective acceptance of known fabricators undermines the entire reliability claim of al-Rijāl. Chapter 5 verse 3 states that the religion was completed, yet hadith were compiled centuries later. The Quran plainly says, "Today I have perfected your religion for you." If Islam was truly perfected during the Prophet's lifetime, why would essential teachings be scattered for 200 plus years before Bukhari came along? Even worse, the entire system for checking which narrators were trustworthy took centuries later to develop. Think about it. God says the religion is complete, but Sunnis claim we need centuries of human effort just to figure out what the complete religion actually included and looked like. That makes no sense. Either God completed the religion as he said, or he left it incomplete until scholars had to piece it together generations later. Both can't be true. Early scholars like Abu Hanifa were not strong in hadith reliance. In fact, he was takfired for rejecting hadith reliance, showing that it wasn't universal. Just look at the comments that were made against Abu Hanifa during his lifetime.
If this mistake had been divided over the Ummah of Muhammad, it would verily have encompassed all of them. No newborn was born in Islam that was worse for them, that is the Muslims, than Abu Hanifa. Nobody was born in Islam that is worse than Abu Hanifa and Abu Muslim, and would not love that it befell my soul that I am better than any of them, even if I would have the dunya and what is in it. That which we resent Abu Hanifa for is that he would come to the Hadith of the Prophet, and then he would contradict it to something else. Nobody was born in Islam that is more calamitous for this ummah than Abu Hanifa.
These statements that were made against Abu Hanifa reveal a very crucial historical fact. One of Islam's most revered jurists, whose legal school is followed by nearly half of all Muslims today, was viciously attacked, specifically because he challenged hadith supremacy. But yet, traditionalists now present absolute hadith reliance as this unquestioned historical consensus. The narrative that hadith centricism was always the orthodox position is contradicted by the life and reception of Abu Hanifa himself. Sunnis consider hadith collections sacred, yet authentic hadith themselves say the Prophet never commanded his sayings to be recorded. In fact, he forbade it. This creates a bizarre contradiction. If hadith are truly essential to the religion, why do the hadith themselves tell us not to record or rely on them? According to Sahih Muslim 3004, the Prophet prohibited writing down his words, yet centuries later hadith collections emerged, completely contradicting this prohibition. If we take hadith seriously, then we must take seriously the hadith that invalidate hadith collections together. We also have multiple hadith that confirm that the Prophet left behind only the Quran, nothing else. Ibn Abbas was asked if the Prophet left anything beside the Quran, and his response? He did not leave anything except what is between the two bindings of the Quran. Ali was asked the same question. He swore by God that they had nothing except the Quran and a personal understanding of it. If even the Prophet's closest companions swore that the only divine text, only wahi that he left was the Quran, how can hadith be considered second divine authority? In Sahih al-Bukhari 2155, the Prophet himself rebuked people for adding regulations and religious conditions that were not found in the Quran. He declared, "Whoever imposes such a condition as is not in Allah's laws, then that condition is invalid, even if he imposes 100 conditions. If a condition not found in the Quran is invalid, then how can a hadith, which imposes countless religious rules outside the Quran, somehow be legitimate? The Quran forbids unnecessary questions. According to Sahih Muslim 12b, it states that the Quran itself warns against excessive questioning of the Prophet. This suggests that Islam was meant to be simple, rooted in the Quran alone, without massive webs of legal rulings found in the Hadith. If Hadith collectors were truly strict in our authentication process, why did they accept narrations from people with extreme, openly biased views? Take Abbad ibn Yaqub, a narrator found in Sahih Bukhari. Despite holding radical Shia beliefs that directly contradict Sunni Islam, he cursed Uthman, one of the 4 rightly guided caliphs. He swore that Talha and Zubair wouldn't enter paradise, 2 of the Prophet's companions. He insisted that Muslims must curse the Prophet's enemies in daily prayers, which is a view exclusive to extreme Shia theology. He taught that the 11 noble leaders from the Prophet's progeny would rule, a clear endorsement of the Shia Imamate doctrine. He even claimed the soil of Karbala is superior to the Kaaba itself. Yet somehow, Bukhari and other Sunni Hadith collectors still included his narrations. This raises a huge problem. Hadith scholars rejected countless narrators for minor disagreements, yet somehow Abbad's extreme anti-Sunni views weren't a deal breaker? So which is it? Were Hadith scholars inconsistent and unreliable, or was the entire process shaped by political convenience rather than any type of divine truth? Either way, the Hadith system collapses under its own contradictions. If scholars selectively accepted narrators based on factors beyond reliability, then how can we trust Hadith as a whole? To drive the point home even more, Imam Dahabi is quoted saying, "If the hadiths of these Shia narrators were to be rejected, a large number of Sunni prophetic traditions would be lost, and this would be a clear corruption." So even by the view of Sunni scholars like Imam Dahabi, we would not have Sunni hadith without the Shia. Yet some Sunnis want to go as far as to say Shia aren't even Muslims by completely takfiring them. And by doing so, they're getting rid of a large part of their corpus, especially according to Imam Dahabi.
I doubt you even a Muslim. You're probably a Shia, innit? You're probably a Shia, innit? They're all kuffar. They're all kuffar. What? Who can do anything about it? What? What? Shia kuffar, what? Do something.
The 6 canonical collections contain contradictory versions of the same events, even on basic biographical facts. For example, Sahih Bukhari claims the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 13 years after receiving revelation, but then contradicts itself by stating it was 10 years in another hadith. Meanwhile, Sahih Muslim reports that the Prophet stayed in Mecca for 15 years while receiving divine revelation. These aren't minor details, but fundamental timeline contradictions about the Prophet's life and collections supposedly vetted for accuracy. Later scholars created even more contradictions trying to fix the original contradictions. Like for example, Sheikh Ahmed Shakir claims Ibn Abbas sometimes counted differently. Ibn Kathir invents this 3-year period when Israfil, not Gabriel, was teaching Muhammad before the Quran's revelation, and Ibn Hajar suggests narrators were simply rounding. So these desperate reconciliation attempts show scholars recognized the contradictions but couldn't admit the obvious, that these collections contained errors. Instead of acknowledging the reality of the problem, they piled on more speculative explanations, creating this house of cards where each solution introduces a new historical claim with zero evidence to support it. So when scholars need elaborate theories to explain away the basic biographical contradictions, the collections themselves cannot be trusted. They necessitate that the narrations are authentic as a starting assumption, and based on that preconceived conclusion, they work backwards to reconcile these obvious contradictions. This is the complete opposite of how legitimate science works. In actual scientific methodology, you would 1. Start with the evidence, which would be the contradictory reports, analyze them objectively without assuming their authenticity, use external corroboration and consistent standards in order to evaluate reliability, be willing to reject reports that fail these verification tests, and then formulate conclusions based on that evidence, not predetermined outcomes. Instead though, Hadith scholars use circular reasoning. These reports must be authentic because they're in authentic compilations, so we must find ways to explain their contradictions. This is like insisting that contradictory witness testimonies in court must all be true, then inventing increasingly elaborate scenarios to make them fit together. A legitimate historical science would acknowledge that contradictory accounts likely indicate unreliability in the transmission process, not divine preservation requiring these elaborate reconciliation theories. Imagine a murder trial where one key witness gives conflicting testimonies at different times, but all are from him.
Let's go over your statements, Joe. First, you told us the suspect was at the crime scene for 10 years, correct?
Yes, that's what I thought.
And then when you testified later, you said it was 13 years. Can you explain why that changed?
I guess I was confused. I didn't remember exactly.
Confused? You are the only eyewitness to this crime, and yet your memory keeps changing. How do you expect us to believe you now when you can't even keep your story straight?
Well, I think I may have just gotten it wrong at the time.
So you got it wrong twice, Joe. You told us 13 years and then 15 years. Are you now asking us to believe you when you say 10 years? Do you have any evidence to support any of these claims?
Be quiet, you kafir. It's all sahih.
The timeline of the crime is very important, but Joe can't seem to agree on how long the suspect was at the crime scene before the murder. His first testimony says, "I saw the suspect at the crime scene for 10 years before the murder." Testimony B, "I saw the suspect at the crime scene for 13 years before the murder." Testimony C, "The suspect was at the crime scene for 15 years before the murder." Now, the judge and the jury recognize that Joe is contradicting himself about the fundamental timeline of the crime. They would question Joe's reliability, especially if he can't even agree on how many years the suspect was present. There would be external evidence like documents, forensic analysis, or surveillance footage that would be used to check if any of Joe's statements match reality. If no external corroboration is found, the court would likely just disregard Joe's testimony or just find it unreliable. But that's not how the Hadith scholars would handle it. They would assume all three testimonies must be true because Joe is a trustworthy witness. Instead of acknowledging the contradictions, the scholars would invent reconciliation theories. Maybe Joe was referring to a longer period of time before and after the murder. The 10 years could include earlier sightings, and the 15 years may refer to the whole context. Or perhaps Joe was counting the suspect's time at the crime scene in phases: 10 years of visible presence, 13 years when he was in the background, and 15 years in total. So they never admit the possibility that Joe simply got it wrong in at least one of his statements. Hadith methodology, however, starts with the assumption that all reports are true if it's sahih, and tries to justify these contradictions. Just like no legitimate court would say, all of Joe's conflicting testimonies must be true, so let's invent ways to make them fit. The Wahi dilemma exposes a fundamental flaw in Sunni reliance on Hadith as a source of religious law. The Quran explicitly states that those who rule by anything other than God's revelation are disbelievers, unjust, and wicked. It also affirms that the scripture alone was sent to judge among the people. This posed a major problem for early Sunni scholars whose legal rulings and theology depended heavily on Hadith. If only God's revelation was to be followed, how could they justify using Hadith as a source of law? To solve this issue, Sunni scholars invented the doctrine that Hadith itself was Wahi, or divine revelation. This idea was first formalized by Shafi'i, who argued that the Quranic term Hikmah, or wisdom, referred to Hadith, which gave it this divine status. However, historical evidence shows that this interpretation was not common before Shafi'i, and was largely his own innovation. Even Hadith contradicts this claim, like in Sahih Bukhari 30047, where Ali is asked if the Prophet left any Wahi besides the Quran, and he emphatically says no. This means that the Hadith, or the idea of the Hadith as revelation, was constructed after the Prophet's time and has no basis in the Quran or early Islamic understandings. But this claim creates a serious theological problem for Sunnis. If Hadith is wahi, then every Sunni scholar must ensure they never falsify a claim of a fabricated Hadith as divine revelation, because the Quran states that falsely attributing revelation to God is one of the worst sins leading to eternal hell. At the same time, they must also ensure they never reject an authentic Hadith that is truly from God, because rejecting even a single revelation is also condemned as a path to hell. The problem is that Hadith science is based on probability assessment, which is zan, not certainty, meaning that scholars cannot be 100% sure which Hadith are truly authentic and which are not. Even the most Hadith scholars like Bukhari and Muslim disagreed over narrators and the reliability of certain Hadith. Given that Hadith compilers rejected around 99% of the narrations they encountered as unreliable, it is impossible that the remaining selections were 100% correct. This means by their own logic, every Sunni scholar has either wrongly accepted a false Hadith as revelation or wrongly rejected an actual revelation, both of which according to their own belief would lead to hell. The Hadith of the drought provides a clear example where major scholars like Ibn Hajar and Ibn Kathir authenticated narration, while al-Albani explicitly weakened it. This shows that even with the same evidence, top scholars reach opposite conclusions about what constitutes wahi in the Hadith. Even more striking is how Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the founder of one of the four major Sunni schools, personally acted upon a Hadith calling upon the angels for help when lost during Hajj. This practice was based on narrations that al-Albani later declared inauthentic. For someone of Ahmad ibn Hanbal's scholarly caliber to accept and implement a Hadith that other authorities reject demonstrates the inherently probabilistic nature of Hadith authentication.
Nishan from India says, what's the ruling on saying, Ya ibadallah a'inuni? What's the ruling if we are in a desert, stranded, or we're lost, and we say, oh servants of Allah, help me? Look right, there's nobody there. Look left, there's nobody there. So who am I calling? Yeah, I'm calling the jinn, or I'm calling the angels. To do what? To guide me. Okay, this is shirk. What are you talking about? Yeah, but it's an issue of dispute among scholars. There's a hadith about Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, Imam Ahmad said so and so. Akhi, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you can ask the jinn to guide you when you are lost and stranded in desert, might as well ask them to show you where the things that were stolen from you, or to help you in operating while opening someone's stomach to operate on him, or do this. All of this is shirk. We don't ask anyone from the world of the unseen except Allah Azza wa Jalla. We don't even ask Jibreel, peace be upon him. We ask only Allah. And asking anyone else as such, saying, oh servants of Allah, help me, and there's no one, and you're claiming to call the jinn or call the angels, this is totally prohibited and shirk.
These real cases prove both aspects of the dilemma. One, scholars face the impossible position of potentially accepting fabricated Hadith as divine revelation or rejecting authentic revelation. And two, Hadith grading operates on probability, not certainty, creating an insurmountable theological problem if Hadith are considered divine revelation with eternal consequences for their misidentification.
فنرجو من الأخوة الذين يحبون تخريج الأحاديث أن يحرروا لنا هذه المسألة. نعم، أي نعم، لكن ما يكفي هذا، ما يكفي، لأن الشيخ الألباني وفقه الله دائما يصحح أحاديث ضعيفة ويضعف أحاديث صحيحة. وقد ألف الشيخ عبد الله الدويش رحمه الله كتابا في هذا الموضوع، فيما صححه الألباني وهو ضعيف، أو فيما ضعفه وهو صحيح. والإنسان بشر، كل يؤخذ من قوله ويترك. فنرجو من الأخوة الذين يحررون الحديث أن يحرروا لنا هذه المسألة، لأنه كثر فيها السؤال الآن.
Some Sunni scholars have written books to challenge and refute each other's judgments on Hadith. This shows that even within the Hadith sciences, there's a lot of disagreement about which Hadith are authentic and which are weak. One example of this is in this book, which focuses on the contradictions and the rulings of Sheikh al-Albani, one of the most well-known Hadith scholars in Sunni circles. The fact that scholars need to write books just to point out these contradictions shows how complicated and uncertain these Hadith scholars are in the grading of Hadith. It says, "In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. It is common knowledge among those who read Sheikh al-Albani's books in Arabic that he often contradicts himself. In one book, he declares a hadith authentic, but then in another, he asserts that it is weak. The critics of Sheikh say that the amount of inconsistency found in his books is beyond what can be attributed to simple human mistakes, the type which was found in the books of the early hadith masters. Therefore, they say that these are clear contradictions and his judgment on a hadith is unreliable. He then continues in his book to list out the various contradictions that Sheikh al-Albani has in a lot of the hadith that he's graded. But this raises an important question. If a scholar as knowledgeable and careful as Sheikh al-Albani can contradict himself so often, how reliable is the process of grading hadith in general? It suggests that the hadith sciences are highly subjective.
Well, I've looked it up in Sahih al-Jami' and Sheikh al-Albani, may Allah have mercy on his soul, graded it as Hasan. I don't know if he graded it as weak elsewhere, but this is what I found in Sahih al-Jami'.
Different scholars can look at the same hadith and reach completely opposite conclusions. This means that the authenticity of a hadith can depend more on the scholar's approach and interpretation rather than the hadith itself, which then leads to this ongoing confusion and disagreement, which proves our earlier dilemma, the Wahi dilemma, as true. Many hadith scholars worked closely with governments of their time, which meant their teachings and reports could be influenced by political rulers. A great example is Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, a famous hadith collector who was heavily connected to the Umayyad rulers. Some scholars criticized him for being too close to the government, saying he allowed himself to be used to serve their interests. For instance, Yahya ibn Ma'in, a respected scholar, preferred another transmitter, al-Aʿmash, over al-Zuhri because al-Aʿmash was stricter in his methods and did not let rulers influence him. It says, quote, when Yahya ibn Ma'in was once asked to compare him with Zuhri, Yahya preferred Aʿmash because he observed more strict transmission procedures than Zuhri, and he did not let himself be used by the authorities as Zuhri had been used by the Umayyads. This wasn't unique to al-Zuhri. Many scholars were employed by rulers as judges, tax collectors, or advisors. The government often promoted hadiths that supported their authority and discouraged rebellion. This means that political power played a role in shaping which hadiths were preserved and spread. It's not unusual to see government officials frequently using their power in order to control which Islamic teaching became official and which ones were rejected. Scholars who disagreed with rulers often faced harsh punishments. For example, Ibn Mujahid, he used political connections in order to enforce which Quranic readings were acceptable. The historical record shows that, quote, those who opposed Ibn Mujahid's officially promulgated canon and insisted on following their own standards and criteria were tried, flogged, and coerced into adhering to the consensus. This wasn't just a scholarly debate on which recitation of the Quran was the most accurate. It was an enforcement through violence. Similarly, you have Imam Malik, who was publicly punished by authorities. As the text notes, quote, he was once stripped and flogged by the then governor of Medina, Ja'far bin Sulaiman ibn Ali. While some claim this was for his position on divorce, Ibn Qutayba records that governor's reason for flogging and subsequently torturing him was because Malik thought nothing of the oath of allegiance to the Abbasids in power. Either way, it shows how political power was used against a lot of these scholars. This created a serious problem for anyone trusting hadith collections. Think about it. If scholars knew they might be beaten or imprisoned for teaching certain things, wouldn't they be careful about which traditions they passed on? Yahya ibn Ma'in even praised some scholars, specifically because, quote, he did not let himself be used by authorities as Zuhri had been used by the Umayyads. This recognition that some scholars were, quote, used by authorities speaks volumes about specifically the political influence on these religious teachings that they transmitted. The Hadith we have today likely favor different viewpoints that rulers approved of, while opposing perspectives may have been silenced. Given these historical realities, we have to question the reliability of Hadith collections as a whole. When scholars faced flogging, torture, and imprisonment for expressing views that contradicted the political authorities, the collection and preservation of Hadith couldn't have been a purely scholarly enterprise. The self-preservation of many of these scholars would have led many scholars to self-censor and carefully select which traditions to preserve and which ones to quietly set aside. The Hadith we have today, they don't represent the complete religious understanding of early Muslims. They represent a version that survived political filtering. Now that we have gone over a couple of faults of Hadith as a source of authentic attributions, let's summarize them. The science of Hadith criticism is riddled with contradictions, as different scholars often disagree on the reliability of narrators. We shared the example of Ikrima earlier. He's constantly cited in Sahih Bukhari, the most authentic compilation of Hadith, yet he's constantly being cited as a deviant while others praise him. Did those who called him a deviant falsely accuse him of such? Or was he actually a deviant and still narrating Hadith in the most authentic compilation? There's also the issue of slander. The personal attacks between major scholars like Imam Malik and Ibn Ishaq expose the subjective nature of narrator criticism. Oftentimes, the al-Rijāl corpus that is responsible for telling us who is trustworthy and who is not is often just used as a means to degrade other scholars without any true basis. Look at the individuals who transmitted the Quran, for example. Hafs is constantly being called a liar, even by the likes of the most trusted al-Rijāl authorities. Yet we know, historically, Hafs' recitation wasn't common during the early period, so claims of Hafs being a liar was a means to slander his reputation in order to deny his recitation any popularity. Same thing can be said about any of these comments, about any of these narrators of the Quran. The fact that we can't tell between the slander and true accusations give us a really big issue within the corpus of al-Rijāl. There's also the issue of the endless loop. Hadith scholars rely on previous scholars' assessments, creating this circular logic where authenticity is assumed rather than proven. Not only is it circular, it's essentially endless regression. At no point does the system offer any independent, objective verification method that doesn't itself depend on further authentication from within the same system. The credibility of each assessment rests entirely on prior assessments, creating this infinite regression with no foundational authority except the system's self-referential validation. This endless loop exposes how al-Rijāl has no epistemologically sound basis for establishing any narrator's reliability, undermining this entire Hadith authentication framework from the beginning. Essentially, the science of al-Rijāl is built on shaky ground. The Hadith authentication system fails at every single level. Scholars contradict each other about narrators, personal feuds influence reliability judgments, and the entire process forms a circular logic with no objective foundation. Even basic facts like how long Muhammad lived in Mecca during the time he received divine inspiration can't be consistently reported. Political rulers manipulated which Hadith survived, while major figures like Abu Hanifa remained skeptical of Hadith altogether. Most troubling is the Quranic paradox. If the Quran is complete like it says in chapter 5 verse 3, and that the Quran is detailed, fully detailed in chapter 6 verse 114, why was a complex Hadith system needed centuries later? The evidence points to an uncomfortable truth for most. Hadith cannot be trusted as a reliable source for Islamic law, theology, or even history. Muslims face a very stark choice, which is follow the clear Quranic guidance or risk building their faith on fabricated traditions that contradict both reason and the Quran itself.
We have permitted the enemies of every prophet, human and jinn devils, to inspire in each other fancy words in order to deceive. Had your Lord willed, they would not have done it. You shall disregard them and their fabrications. This is to let the minds of those who do not believe in the hereafter listen to such fabrications and accept them, and thus expose their real convictions. Shall I seek other than God as a source of law when He has revealed to you this book fully detailed? Those who receive the scripture recognize that it has been revealed from your Lord truthfully. You shall not harbor any doubt.